It's very kind of you, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Unlike Tony, I don't have snow, but I have a lot of rain in cold and soggy England. So it's very pleasant to have the opportunity to talk at this session instead of sitting in the garden. I thought I'd talk on three themes which sort of build on what Tony's already said. I think the first is the whole range of ambiguities that surround the global commitment to decarbonisation. I think some of these are not often articulated well enough. Secondly, I thought I'd talk about the way that those create challenges for sort of key players in the debate, both the advocates, the more extreme advocates of rapid adjustment, but also donor agencies and host governments where you have production of either fossil fuels or metals. And then I thought we'd just sort of link it to the geopolitics, because I think the theme of today is really about the peace building and the manner in which extractives can contribute to or make it more difficult to achieve harmony in countries and between countries as we move forward into the next 20 or 30 years. So let's start with the ambiguities. It's absolutely clear in the global agenda that fossil fuels, especially coal, will be stranded. But there's a very big question about how fast that will take place, and indeed how fast it should take place in lower income countries. And I mentioned immediately a sort of a big conflict between SDG 7, which is about giving more clean energy to more people in poorer countries, and the global commitments from Paris 2015. A lot of the countries in the low income category that are seeking to get improved energy access from a very low starting point will find that easier and cheaper to achieve if they use coal. Now, are they going to be allowed to do that in order to achieve SDG 7, or will they be hindered by the commitment they also make to reduce carbon? So that I'm not giving you an answer to that question, I'm just posing the question. The second ambiguity is about natural gas. As Tony also said, that will be stranded much more slowly over a period of 10 or 20 years. But I think especially the climate activists need to understand that it will remain an important fuel for energy for quite a long time. It will be very important to major consumers like China as they move out of dependence on coal. It's clear, absolutely clear, I think, to all the analysts I've seen that gas will continue to be used in absolutely larger amounts in countries like China for quite a considerable period of time. But it will also be a significant resource for some of the new producers of LNG in particular. Mozambique and Tanzania are two sort of obvious examples of that. And the third and the most difficult ambiguity is about the metals. The global demand for metals is absolutely critical to the energy transition. The energy transition, whether it's electric vehicles or photovoltaic panels or hydrogen fuels or wind turbines, has a huge dependence on metals. Some of them are the more exotic rare earths and other similar metals that are used in minute amounts, but in all of our mobile phones and in all of the renewable resources. And we have some frightening geopolitical issues associated with that. The first one, I think, is the increasing control of some of these more exotic metals by China. The EU has published a paper in which it shows that 60 to 90% of at least half of the critical metals are produced and controlled from China. That is true also for the metals that are crucial for the Western defense, communication and IT industries. Insofar as the Western countries are trying to avoid the dependence on China, they're scrambling to find new sources. And two of those sources, one is Greenland. Donald Trump, when he was president until today, tried to buy Greenland because of the mineral resources. And we are starting to think about extracting from the deep oceans, which creates another round of resource damage potentially. And the last point, of course, is the fragile states, not least countries like the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, which control very large percentages of some of the crucial metal. What are we going to do with that situation? So these are some ambiguities. So then let's look, next slide, Fabian, please. Let's look at some of the challenges. If you come at this from the point of view of a very sort of strenuous climate advocate, let's say Extinction Revolution, if you're so minded to join that, you would be probably arguing for a very rapid phase out of most extractive production, very rapid. But the difficulty with that is that it would seriously compromise the logical energy transition anticipated for countries such as China in the medium term. They will need gas. They won't need so much coal, but they will need gas. You push them to the wall and say, you've got to get rid of gas as well. If so, how do you then get the green energy transition in China that would otherwise be possible? Secondly, were you to do that, you would undermine the energy access for some low-income countries, which is still and will continue to be linked to coal and gas for some considerable period of time. This is the SDG 7 point again. Third, it would deny the world some of the absolutely critical metals that we need to do electric vehicles, wind turbines, photovoltaics, and so on. And it would remove an opportunity that quite a few low-income countries have to increase their production of these critical metals and provide themselves with an opportunity, therefore, to boost their incomes and their development over time. So a big problem if you're a sort of strenuous climate advocate. What if you're the World Bank, where I used to work? Well, the World Bank has already committed to sort of stop its support to countries in production of coal, fair enough. But it's now in the same position, or potentially in the same position as regards to coal and some mining. Tony and myself were in the World Bank 2 years ago when we spoke first to the mining department, then we spoke to the Africa department. The mining department is clearly scaling back, putting less support into the countries, into the activities of mining activity in low-income countries, even though we still have 50 or so low-income and middle-income countries that are dependent both on extractive industries and on development support. So there's a dilemma for those agencies. And we push over the page, Fabian, please. Next slide. What about the countries, and especially the governments of the European and Western countries? The big problem here is that we are very heavily committed to the green agenda, and we've been very successful. You know, Germany in particular, UK is doing a very, very good job in moving towards renewables, banning diesel cars and these sorts of policies. But I think in the debate about that, what we have not really properly recognized is that these countries have become consumers of the critical metals that are required for these new renewable technologies. The graphic on the right-hand side is really scary. And if you go back to the 1850s, Europe controlled something like 60% of global mineral production. Today it's 3%. If you go into the 1930s, 40s, America controlled 40% of global mineral production. Today it's 5%. Basically, the Western countries have given up, except, you know, I exclude Canada and Australia from this, but Canada is a Western country. They've given up on producing metals for obvious reasons. The environmental lobbies have made it difficult to do. You try opening a coal mine in Britain or in Germany, you try opening a rare earth plant in any of these countries, it's incredibly difficult to do because you do not have the social support of your environmental lobbies to do that. So we're buying the metals from other countries, and you can see many of the lower and middle-income countries are producing these metals. But what we have not done in our climate policies, when we ban diesel cars, we have not really done anything to internalize the externalities produced in the extraction of these metals in countries like DRC, Ghana, Tanzania, Mozambique, and so on. We've really not done that. We've essentially exported our environmental mess to other countries. And we see that too, I think, in the recycling of waste products from Europe to countries like Turkey, China, and elsewhere. So there's a really big problem for the Western governments. You know, if you're serious about this energy transition and this greening agenda, what do you do about the fact that you're essentially exporting your environmental problems to other countries? So that's the challenge for the Western countries. Then next slide, Fabian, please. The challenge for the producing countries, especially the low-income ones, first the opportunities and the threats. I think the stranding of fossil fuels creates new economic and social tensions for the countries where it happens. Because if they take the Paris commitment seriously, then they will sort of stop doing things that are needed for both income generation amongst the people who produce the minerals, and also the people who use them as energy. And this could be extremely destabilizing in some countries, which is another reason why the world community might say we can go slowly on reducing fossil fuel use and extraction in lower income countries. That's a question, that's not a suggestion. But if these countries that have the opportunity to produce more of the critical energy metals, it's a great opportunity, but it's going to need a great deal of vision and new policy frameworks to take full advantage of that. Because they create a lot of very new risks. You take something like lithium. I mean, there are several countries in the third world that can produce lithium, but there's going to be huge competition to produce it. So you might get a government that commits to it, invests a lot of resources in it, and then discovers, 3 years later that it's lost the market because another country is doing it more cheaply or more effectively. The environment. I think this is the big one. I think this is the one we really, really have not faced up to in the West. We love our mobile phones, we love our renewable vehicles, and we're all pushing for that and arguing for it. But I don't think we really truly understand how dangerous it is to extract some of the metals that are needed for this. The reason they have moved out of France, the reason they've moved out of the United States to a significant extent, is because they are closely associated with radioactivity. The mining of them is extraordinarily difficult. If you look at some of the pictures of the artisanal mining of cobalt in the DRC, you'll be absolutely shocked. In China, there are these huge areas that are mining rare earths, which are called cancer cities by local populations because they create huge amounts of illness and external problems for the environment. So the environment is a big problem. And how we manage that, I think, is going to be a big challenge going forward. The third point, and this has been mentioned, taxation. There's a lot of discussion about how the producers of minerals in the third world should gain more revenue from those activities. But one of the issues linked to that is, should they take some responsibility for raising taxes to deal with the environmental externalities that arise when their minerals are used in the purchasing countries in Western Europe or in the United States? That's a very dramatic suggestion. It's one way to sort of get proper carbon taxation implemented globally, but of course it would put a huge burden on those low-income countries that do that, because it would completely undermine their ability to attract the foreign investment that they need to continue as effective mineral producers. Okay, and the scramble for the resources, especially Africa's metals, China versus the United States, China versus Japan. This has already started. We're seeing huge global tensions over some of these issues, not least between China and Japan. So the last slide, Fabian, please, then I'll stop. There's a very interesting report by IRENA, the International Energy Agency, on the geopolitics of the energy transition. And I've quoted 3 things from it because I thought these would be useful in the discussion. The first one is that the transition from fossil fuels to renewables will transform global power relations. A simple way of putting this is that, in the 19th century, global relations were dominated by coal, dominated by Western Europe. In the 20th century, they were dominated by oil, with a strong monopoly power from the Middle East. And in the new energy transition, we're going to be dominated by specialist metals, dominated by China. It will have changed the influence of particular states. But there's a very positive thing in the last quotation. The energy transformation driven by renewables will provide fewer instances of energy statecraft, the use of energy resources, an instrument of foreign policy. That's a statement by IRENA. But a lot of things I've read recently suggest that that is not in fact the case. There is the possibility that the monopolization of some of the rare metals, in particular in countries like China, will give those countries an extraordinarily strong leverage in international geopolitics, creating a great deal of tensions between themselves and the countries that are needing those metals, both for their renewable activities, but also for their strategic industries like defence. And I think this is perhaps where the biggest threat to peace coming from the extractive industries currently lies. Thank you very much for your time.